Thank you very much, Sam, for being with us on behalf of our sisterhood, on behalf of our Adults Education Committee. I would like to welcome to Hewlett-East Sokol, a Jewish Center, to HERJC, Congregation Etz Chaim, for this talk about Israel. We are really looking forward to hearing from you because we are concerned. We love Israel, and we know that we are today facing a very, very challenging moment that we will try to understand through you. So some words on Sam. Sam Sokol is a reporter for Haaretz. He was previously a correspondent at the Jerusalem Post and has reported for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, the Israel Broadcasting Authority, and the Times of Israel. He is the author of Putin's Hybrid War and the Jews, and the winner of the 2015 B'nai B'rith World Center Award for Excellence in Diaspora Reportage. Thank you again, Sam, for being with us, and please help us to understand what's going on.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. My pleasure. So as you mentioned, the issue of the actually is, maybe we could go back to the grid because now I'm seeing myself and it's a little distracting. Can we go back to the regular grid? Okay, perfect. Thank you. So the issue of the judicial reform in Israel obviously has been something that has caught the attention of, diaspora Jewry. It's obviously something that has gotten Israelis riled up to a degree that we haven't seen in decades. And it sort of raises the question, why? What is going on here that could spark such passions? And before we get to the reasons, though, just we should have a bit of a word for those who don't know about what's happening now. For the past, I want to say 20 weeks, 21, at a certain point you start to lose track, about 21 weeks, Israelis have been coming out weekly, massive weekly protests every Saturday night across the country, mostly in Tel Aviv, but across the country, Haifa, Jerusalem, etc., to protest an effort by the current Netanyahu government to overhaul the judicial system. Now, I want to be very careful in the terminology that I'm using because I have colleagues who use the term judicial coup in their reporting, which I feel is tendentious. And the supporters of the overhaul call it a reform, which I feel that adopting that kind of language sort of implies approval. And so I like to try to take a bit more of a neutral phrasing, at least in my reporting. I have my personal views, but those don't come through in what I report, or at least I hope they don't. But this protest movement that we've seen, the Israel Democracy Institute, a think tank in Jerusalem that has done some really excellent research on these issues, did a poll about, I want to say a month and a half ago, and found that at the time, 1 in 5 Israelis had attended at least one anti-government protest. That means 20% of the population of this country has been motivated by a political issue, and one which, generally speaking, would seem to be something rather technical and dry that wouldn't excite popular passions. But 1 in 5 Israelis has gone out to protest. You see the weekly protests in Tel Aviv, hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets. And you have to wonder, what is it about, judicial appointment committees and judicial oversight and the issues of justiciability and standing and the ability of the Knesset theoretically under pending legislation to override decisions of the High Court voiding laws? What is it about this that really excites popular passion? And for this, we sort of have to go back to the beginning of the state. Now, in the beginning, Israel was established without a constitution. The initial Ben-Gurion government was pretty much set against the idea of a constitution because it would have limited the power of the Knesset. And the different parties involved, from the religious right to the socialist left, really had this sort of consensus that we're not going to come together on the issues. We're not going to agree on the role of religion and state. We're not going to agree on different things. We're going to push this, off. We're going to kick the can down the road. And the issues that separate Israelis have become increasingly vexing and divisive over the years. And it's become even more difficult to imagine bridging the gaps. So the issue of a constitution sort of has been something that's been swept under the rug. Now, the problem is that many institutions in Israel, which are regulated by a constitutional order in the United States, were essentially allowed to develop in an ad hoc fashion in Israel, meaning that through a combination of legislation and developing customs and bureaucratic procedures, sort of a form of government has emerged, but there's really no proper constitutional basis for anything. Israel has 12 quasi-constitutional chokei yesod, basic laws. Now, these basic laws are laws that were passed to regulate, how the judiciary works and how the Knesset functions and who has the right to vote. But they were never really intended. They were explicitly not intended to have any sort of constitutional status originally. And what happened in the 1990s, when Aaron Barak was the president of the Supreme Court, the Bagatz, as it's known in in Israel, there was a constitutional revolution. But under Barak, the court started to do away with restrictions on standing and to expand its power of judicial review. It was sort of the Israeli Marbury versus Madison moment, where the court established we have the power to overturn laws, and the basis of that are the basic laws, which the court invested with quasi-constitutional status. Now, there were a couple issues with this. The first issue was that the basic laws are passed like any other laws. They need a Knesset majority. They can be passed, and they can be amended. So on many different occasions, governments from the right to the left would amend basic laws in order to allow for such things as rotations between prime ministers and other sort of electoral shtick that whether you like the parties involved or don't like the parties involved or agree that it's a good political move or not, sort of was problematic in that the rules of the game were mutable and could be changed in the middle. And the other issue was that while the issue of judicial review, the power of a high court to overturn legislation based on it violating some agreed set of, fundamental rules, is the bedrock of any Western democracy. And the types of countries that have harmed that judicial oversight, such as Poland and Hungary, have generally been seen as engaged in democratic backsliding. The problem in Israel was that these laws were expressly not intended not to have constitutional status, and that the court was widely seen as activist, as getting involved in issues which legislators really hadn't given them permission to engage in. Now, the reputation of the court as left-leaning and activist is much less deserved than many on the Israeli right would have you think. It's the record for striking down laws is much less than in other comparable democracies, although the issue, again, is sort of the issue of legitimacy. There's never been sort of that effort to create a really agreed upon legal basis for everything that had emerged. And the issue is that it had generally been accepted across the spectrum, except for certain parts of the hard right, that the court was legitimate and these powers were legitimate. And even Benjamin Netanyahu on many occasions had publicly come out to defend the authority of the court. Now, the issue here is that if before the current crisis started, if you had asked scholars or experts across the spectrum, from right to left, is there a need for reform? Is there a need to rationalize the basis for the courts through legislation, to define basic laws differently from other laws, to set a higher bar for voting for them? You would have, generally speaking, a consensus. Yeah, maybe we should do this. The ideas of what should be done would be different, but there was a basic consensus that some reforms are necessary. And I think this is something I personally agree with. I would have supported reform. The problem in the eyes of many Israelis is that what's happening now is not reform. It's an attempt to completely undermine the entire basis of the justice system's power. Now, why is this happening now? What could have happened to take Benjamin Netanyahu, a politician who had always spoken up in defense of the court historically, to suddenly turn against it? Does anybody have an idea of what happened in the last few years that would have soured Netanyahu on the courts? Indictment. He was indicted by his Attorney General, Avichai Mandelblit, on multiple charges of corruption and bribery. He is currently on trial for breach of trust and other issues of corruption for alleged bribe taking and quid pro quo deals where he used the power of government to benefit powerful people in exchange for favors, and for accepting gifts, which are, for allegedly accepting gifts that are illegal under Israeli law. Now, when this started, Netanyahu began using rhetoric very reminiscent of Donald Trump. The media is out to get me. The corrupt prosecutors are out to get me. The justice system is out to get me. The police, etc. It was a very populist kind of rallying cry. The elites are out to get me. And there's nothing that represents in the minds of many on the Israeli right, sort of this old Ashkenazi elite, than the high court. Now, this is, again, there are plenty of people, justices on the court, who were appointed by right-wing governments. And it's not such a simple thing, but the reputation persists. And so Netanyahu had an sort of a motivation to try to limit the power of the court. And at the same time, he had, one, alienated many of his allies on the right. People on the right who have turned against him, like Avigdor Lieberman and Naftali Bennett and Gideon Sa'ar, were all close to him at one point. We're all very close allies. Full disclosure, I won't say who I vote for now, but in the past I have voted for Netanyahu, not anytime recently, but I'm a former Likud voter. And, many people on the right sort of felt alienated by Netanyahu. At the same time, none of the parties in the center or the center left, which would have entertained a coalition with Netanyahu in the past, after several failed rounds of elections and after the beginning of his trial, nobody who would have, on the other side, who would have sat with him in a government previously, was willing to sit with Netanyahu. There was this sort of divide in Israeli society. It was no longer about right versus left. It was about pro-Netanyahu versus anti-Netanyahu. Are you in the pro-Netanyahu coalition or the anti-Netanyahu coalition? Now, when he won in the last elections, when the Israeli right won in the last elections, there was a large part of the right that, was against him, that wasn't going to sit with him. Naftali Bennett's people, Gideon Sa'ar's people, Lieberman, as I said, none of them who would have been natural partners were willing to sit with him. So he had to turn to allies on the extreme right, people like Itamar Ben-Gvir from the Otzma Yehudit Jewish Power Party, a disciple of Rabbi Meir Kahane, who is well known in Israel for having worked as a lawyer for accused Jewish terrorists, for pulling his own gun out at people on a couple of occasions for really incendiary rhetoric. And some of his other allies who have been his allies over the past decade are the ultra-Orthodox parties, which have long resented the High Court for its ruling, which has been put in abeyance for a number of years. It really hasn't been implemented, but for its ruling that legislation exempting full-time yeshiva students from the army is unconstitutional because it violates the right to equality under the basic laws. So, he had a motivation to try to clip the wings of the court, and he had coalition partners who were very supportive of such an agenda. The two main people in his coalition who are behind this are Simcha Rothman, the chairman of the Knesset Constitution, Law and Justice Committee, who is a longtime critic of the court, and his justice minister from his ruling Likud party, Yariv Levin, who is also very dogmatic in his approach to the court. Now, after being elected, Netanyahu's government, Levin, came out, had a press conference. We are going to overhaul the court system. Now, what did they want to do? In a nutshell, there's a lot of complicated stuff here. I'm going to sort of boil it down to the main points. One, they wanted to overhaul the committee that chooses judges. In the United States, the president nominates a judge, it goes to the Senate, and the Senate votes. And leaving aside, the last couple of administrations when there's been a lot of brinksmanship and issues with nominations, thinking of Merrick Garland, and you all know about this. Leaving that aside, for most of American history, you had justices who were passed with a large majority in the Senate. Basically, presidents were forced to pick people who would be able to garner bipartisan support during the hearings, no matter how they ended up in the end, as a right-wing ideologue or a left-wing ideologue or whatever they would be. They had to be someone who would gain wide approval. In Israel, it's a slightly different system. The system was engineered with the idea that the politicians shouldn't have the final deciding say. So there's a committee that involves representatives of the High Court itself. It involves representatives of the Bar Association, members of the government, and Knesset members. It's essentially a system for making sure that the government can't railroad its candidates through. And it's been accused by critics of being too heavily weighted towards the court, allowing it to perpetuate itself. That's not quite true, but it does allow a great deal of input from the court. And there's a legitimate debate over how the committee should be composed. I'm not going to say who's right or who's wrong, but it's a legitimate debate. The issue here is that this new government didn't want to tweak things or go to a different system. What they wanted to do, they said, in America, they choose the judges. We're going to do that here. They said, we're going to have a committee that's stacked in such a way that the government is able to pass its candidates without anyone from the opposition or the legal community having the right to overrule them, having a veto, an automatic majority for the ruling coalition. Now, the problem is, like in America, it's the government choosing the judges. But unlike in America, there's no need to then put it to the full Knesset to get everybody to vote for it. It's as if the president could pick his own candidate and just appoint him without Senate confirmation. And this is something that would have very much benefited Netanyahu, because if you control the career path for judges, who's appointed to the to the local court, to the district court, to the high court, then that gives you a lot of leverage, when they're going to be sitting and in a few years hearing your appeal. You'll be able to say, if you want to advance, maybe be a little easier on me. At the same time, Netanyahu when I say Netanyahu, by the way, I should specify that, largely speaking, Netanyahu, while he's been very publicly in support of this, has, from all reports, really been nervous about what's happening, because he realizes he's sort of climbed up a pole. He's being pushed by the ideologues in his coalition into actions which are more extreme than he might have wanted initially. But The government now is also pushing measures to restrict the ability of the High Court to overrule legislation. So they're demanding a overwhelming majority of justices in the court, nearly all of them vote unanimously to overturn legislation, to exempt certain types of legislation from judicial oversight, and to allow, and this is something that appears to have been dropped, but was being pushed for a long time, to allow a bare majority of 61 out of 120 lawmakers to overturn a court ruling invalidating legislation. It's something called the override clause. Now, all this together would have essentially meant that the court would have no power to overrule legislation. There would be no checks and balances on the legislature. Now, again, there's a very legitimate debate about the power of the court because its basis needs to be rationalized. It's used, it's used things like the reasonability standard to strike down government decisions it disagrees with in ways that even defenders of the standard think are can be excessive. The reasonability standard basically saying if the government doesn't take into account relevant criteria into something that is, in the views of the judges, unreasonable, then this can be struck down. Now, this is something with a lot of precedent in, Anglo and Commonwealth law. This is not something made up by Israeli justices. This is really something that's known in the international legal community. But it's gone a little, in the eyes of many Israelis, it's gone a little too far. But so there's a legitimate debate. I think the best way, there's sort of a mashal that I like, sort of the analogy that I like to use is if you have a puppy who, you buy a puppy and you take him home and he pees on the rug. You have a really nice, expensive rug in the living room and he pees on the rug. Do you shove his nose in it and go, bad, bad, no? Or do you cut his head off with an axe? Either way, you've correctly identified the problem, but one is training a puppy and the other is animal cruelty. The other is an extreme overreaction that most people would recoil from. That's essentially what I think many people here see the legal overhaul as being. It's cutting the puppy's head off with an axe. People instinctively look at this and go, this isn't good. Now, the problem is that the current government has also attempted to pass other legislation which would fundamentally alter many longstanding status quos in terms of religion and state, in terms of the conflict of the Palestinians. So the current coalition, in its coalition agreement with the ultra-Orthodox parties, the Likud has basically obligated itself to push legislation keeping Haredim out of the army, to try to solve this issue once and for all. It recently passed legislation banning chametz from hospitals on Pesach. And it's rolled back a number of reforms to the system, overhauls to the system from the previous administration, which would have opened up the religious bureaucracy a little more. Now, one of the issues that the government has been pushing is to withdraw recognition from non-Orthodox conversions performed abroad, to change who's considered a Jew under the law of return. So there's a lot of changes that they're trying to push. And the fear of many on the Israeli center and left is essentially, if this government is able to get rid of judicial oversight, what laws will they pass? And it's made many people even more nervous about this overhaul. By the same token, there are people on the Israeli right who are nervous, saying, well, if the right can do this, what stops the left from doing, from passing whatever it wants when it gets in power? What stops whatever party's in power from, changing the laws to allow themselves to stay in power? And in fact, at one point, Simcha Rothman, during a Knesset debate, admitted that under the reforms, technically the right to vote would no longer be protected for Israelis. and laws infringing on that right could be passed. And he said, but we're not going to do it. Just trust us. And it's sort of people look at this and go, well, someone says, I'm going to take away your rights, but trust me, I'm not going to act on it. People get a little nervous. So that's sort of where it leaves us. Now, polling, and this is already out of date, but it's the most recent I've seen on this specific issue. But polling from a couple of months ago showed that something like 40% of Likud voters, more than 40% of Likud voters, were against the overhaul, specifically against the override clause. So that's really where we stand right now. Hundreds of thousands of people out every single week, a government which is pushing this reform. And this essentially, we would have probably already seen it passed, except for one thing. There was a little bit of overreach. Now, after months and months of protests, we started to see something of a worrying trend, which was protesters against the overhaul, saying that they would refuse to serve in their reserve units for training or standard missions, short of a war, which everybody would go. They were refusing to serve in the reserves. Now, there are, certain units in the IDF that rely on a regular, cycle of reservists passing through in order to function. Certain air crews, intelligence, certain units in special operations. And when this happened, it started to really cause worry. And so at one point, the defense minister came out and said, listen, in a public statement, Netanyahu, we've got to hold this back. We've got to stop. This is causing a national security issue. And Netanyahu, this is where the overreach comes in. Netanyahu then turns around and says, you're fired, get out. He fires his defense minister. Now, this was a step too far for many people. And what we saw was a massive nationwide protest that dwarfed anything we had seen before. Essentially, the heads of the major banks and corporations, most of the representatives of capital in Israel got together with the heads of the Histadrut and the labor unions in a way we've never seen before, and basically said, we're shutting down the country. Labor and capital, two groups that are usually, somewhat at odds, saying, we're going to work together. We're shutting down everything. They shut down the airport. They shut down the schools. I live in Beit Shemesh, so nothing was shut down. But the rest of the country, like where the real Israelis live, was shut down. So Gule Gamle. So this really sort of forced Netanyahu to do two things. One, to back up and cancel his firing of his defense minister. And second, to take up President Isaac Herzog's offer to broker talks with the opposition. Netanyahu essentially said, okay, I'm going to take a pause until after Yom Ha'atzmaut, till after Independence Day, and I'll talk. Independence Day has come and gone. The talks appear to be stuck. And now you're starting to see talk from Netanyahu and his allies about pushing again on the judicial overhaul. But at the moment, they're not. At the moment, things appear to be paused. But the protests haven't stopped. And they've grown in terms of scope because there's a large amount of anger in Israeli society at certain inequalities, at the fact that secular or national religious children, parents' children go to the army, ultra-Orthodox children don't. That's a bit of an oversimplification. I personally served in Nachal Haredi, which is a infantry battalion, which is ultra-Orthodox. I'm not ultra-Orthodox, but I'm, Orthodox, and I served in an ultra-Orthodox unit with ultra-Orthodox soldiers. But generally speaking, it breaks down that way, and where the ultra-Orthodox don't serve. And given that the ultra-Orthodox are trying to overturn the religious status quo, and at the same time are major backers of this overhaul, it led to massive public anger at the ultra-Orthodox. And you start to see sort of like a feature creep, where more and more issues are getting rolled into, or were initially protested against judicial overhaul, but have now morphed into protests on a range of issues, from LGBT rights to religion and state to what's happening out in Judea and Samaria, Yehuda v'Shomron, the West Bank, whatever you want to call it. But so now it's sort of this just anti-Netanyahu, anti-government protest movement. And that's where we're sort of left right now. I'm not going to say that the social cleavages are as bad as in the United States, but there are issues. I think, in the United States, American identity has always been predicated on the idea of accepting a certain common set of democratic values, a certain vision for what it means to be an American, because there's no American ethnicity or nationality. It's people from all over accepting a common identity. So when that breaks down, you really get harsh social cleavages. In Israel, no matter how bad it is, it's a small country. Everybody's related. Everybody knows everybody else. You meet some random guy in the street. You probably served in the army with his cousin. And there's this feeling, we're all Jews in it together. So the social cleavages aren't as bad as in America, but they're getting pretty bad. And, many people are worried. One of the major things that we're seeing now, and I don't think it's something that's getting a lot of attention in the United States, is the impact on the economy. The Israeli economy, due to the overhaul, has really started to slow down. There's a worry in the business community that anything that undermines the rule of law will harm the ability of businesses to function in this country. They want a stable environment for business. So we've started to see many Israeli corporations look into removing funds or workers or even relocate abroad. It's harming Israel's reputation, which is going to hurt investment. And we've seen billions of dollars of capital flow out of the country by, business leaders here who are legitimately scared. When someone has a large corporation, when they have thousands of employees and hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in market cap, they're not going to make a business decision based on political ideology. They're going to make it on economic factors. And most of the economists in Israel and the current head of the Bank of Israel have actually said, this is going to destroy the economy. This is going to cause a brain drain. And I think aside from issues of rights or, legal issues, many Israelis are now scared for their, just for their daily bread, so to speak, just for their parnasa. So that's basically where we're left now. What I think I'd like to do is sort of open it up more for a dialogue and for questions, because I found in doing a lot of these talks that frequently people who are listening will, come up with, remind me of an aspect of this that I had neglected to mention, or will really have good questions. So let's go with that. Rabbi?
So Sam, I would like to help you here, and I would ask everyone who wants to ask a question to raise their hand, as I just did. So on the bottom of your screen, there is a button called reactions. And there, if you click, you are going to see raise hand. If you do it, it will be easier for us to organize the line of questions. But before you find the button, we have Arthur with your first question. Arthur, please unmute yourself.
Okay, I am unmuted. What's the likelihood or the potential for this government failing and new elections being called?
So much less than they were a week ago. So you had the budget, which was just passed last week. Now, the issue is that under Israeli law, if by the budget deadline, there's a certain cutoff date. If by the budget deadline you don't have a budget passed, the Knesset automatically dissolves and the country goes to elections. Now, multiple coalition partners of Netanyahu basically threatened to tank the government if they didn't get, what they wanted in terms of funding and promises for legislation. So initially, the ultra-Orthodox parties threatened to tank the coalition by not voting for the budget if they didn't get their law exempting them from from military service. And they backed down on that, but they ended up getting, over the next few years, billions of shekels in additional funding for schools, which, Netanyahu sort of framed this as saying, ultra-Orthodox pupils deserve equal funding to secular pupils in terms of their schools. What he neglected to mention was they don't get any, there's no equivalent, equality in the education they're getting. So this is money that's now being given to schools which don't meet the education ministry criteria for teaching a core curriculum, secular subjects, math, English, etc. So they got this now from the government, angering many people. And the issue is they got what they wanted. They voted for the budget. Same thing with parties, other parties in the coalition. And so if you had asked me a week ago, I would have said, if any of these parties decide to tank the coalition, we're going to new elections. At this point, it looks like we're still sailing steady for a while. You never know in Israeli politics what'll upset the apple cart, what'll send us scrambling back to the voting booth. But at this point, it doesn't look like it's happening. I'll tell you one anecdote, because we did have that series of election after election after election ad nauseum, that I remember when they announced the last election, I was in the newsroom and a colleague of mine comes in and hears the news that we're about to have another election. I remember her screaming, "No, no, not again. I won't do it again. You can't make me, expletive deleted." Which I think basically summed up the feeling of every single correspondent in this country. An election every few years is exciting. An election every few months is exhausting. But I think a lot of Israelis would welcome another election now.
Yossi, please.
First of all, thank you very much, Sam, for giving such a thorough presentation. And it's really great. I'm an Israeli, so I have a question for you. Israeli American.
Yes.
Do you think there is a stress between the Mizrahim and the Ashkenazim? Because the Ashkenazim are the elite, and the court consists basically of Ashkenazim. So do you think there is some kind of a pressure between two groups rather than the particular of the law?
לא כל כך, באמת. בינינו אני לא חושב שזה... Yeah, sorry, I'll stick to English here. I don't really think it's so much of an issue, Mizrahi versus Ashkenazi, Sfaradi, Ashkenazi, I don't really, it's an issue, but I think it's an issue that gets overhyped. Day to day, I don't really particularly see it. Obviously, it's an issue that has an impact, but I think it gets over-exaggerated.
Because when you sit here in the US and you see the demonstration in Beersheba, which is Mizrahi, and the fact that Netanyahu has many more Mizrahim behind him than other groups, so I thought maybe there was some kind.
Look, the Israeli right has enjoyed more support in the Mizrahi community since Menachem Begin's day. That's, yes. And if you're talking in terms of who's supporting what side, I think it's simplistic to say it's Ashkenazi versus Sfaradi. But yeah, there is a preponderance of like one group or another on one side or another. But it doesn't necessarily mean the two groups are pitted against each other. I don't really see that as something that's happening. It's a question of demographics, who's on what side more, like what, this guy is probably on that side or that guy, based on where he's from and what his roots are, what his education is, and where he lives in the country might be more on that side. But you don't see like tension between the two groups. I mean, I'm Ashkenazi, my wife is Sfaradi, and I guess that's the only tension there would be, because I've learned, not to be too outspoken in my political opinions because I'll be wrong. But aside from that, I don't see it.
Maybe some there is a resentment from the Sephardim or Mizrahim that do not see themselves so represented at the court. And Netanyahu is somehow taking advantage of this resentment. Oh,
that's definitely some part of what's happening. I'm definitely not saying that's not happening. That's definitely a factor. There are multiple groups that have a certain amount of resentment towards the court. Mitnachalim, settlers, the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, Sfaradim. But by the same token, I think the part that gets, misinterpreted a lot is that people seem to think of it as something where there's tension between Sfaradim and Ashkenazim in Israel. And I don't really, I think there's a definite sort of sense of resentment, but you also see that resentment against the idea of elites and old elites and the old, socialist elites among Ashkenazi,
yes.
People on the right as well. So, I think there's a whole host of factors, and it's hard to reduce it to one thing or another, but that's definitely an important component. You're correct in that.
Roberta, please.
Hi, I'd like to thank you for giving such an interesting talk.
Thank you.
But I have a question. I don't know if this could be answered, but do you have a prediction for whether these proposed judicial changes are going to go through, or what's going to ultimately happen with this?
I don't think they're going to go through in their entirety. I'm going to say this. I think people in my profession have a very good track record at reporting on what has happened, and we're pretty darn good at saying what is happening, and we are absolutely totally crap at predicting what will happen. Ask me what's happening now, I'm good at that. Ask me what happened, I'll be able to analyze it. I don't think that anyone can really say what will happen. The one thing I can guarantee for sure is that whatever does happen is going to mean a lot more work for people like me and a lot more tension for everybody else. This is a joke I make at every single lecture, but I think it has a certain kernel of truth, is that if the news cycle gets any more intense, I might just call up a real estate agent to help me find a cave in the Negev to hide in until this blows over.
Thank you.
Sam, in addition to the lack of constitution, there is no real separation between the executive and legislative branches in Israel. I'd like you to comment on this factor, please.
So that's a very, very good point. Thank you for bringing that up. So obviously in the United States, you have three separate branches that each check and balance the other. Now, you vote for the president separately. You vote for Congress separately. It's very often you'll have a situation where the president will be from one party and Congress will be dominated by the other party. So this is something that during a normal, less polarized time, let's leave aside recent years again in American politics, is something that's healthy. But in Israel, you don't have that. You don't have, let's start with how lawmakers are elected. You don't have anybody who represents you. There's no one you can point to in Knesset and goes, this is my representative. They don't care about like the individual voter in that sense, because what you have is you have parties who are running lists of candidates in a proportional representation system, meaning if your party gets 10% of the overall votes, then you get 10% of the seats in the Knesset, and that number of seats that you get, corresponds to the number of people from the top of your list who get into the Knesset. Anyone under that point on the list, under the cutoff, doesn't get in. So they represent ideological constituencies rather than locales or specific communities. So, for instance, I live in Beit Shemesh. There's no one in the Knesset who represents Beit Shemesh who cares about me. Technically, our former mayor is in the Knesset. Frankly, I'm very happy he's there because it means he's no longer running my city, but that's a different issue. But so what you have is, instead of having a system where you have individual representatives representing individual districts, and where you have pressure, sort of a structural pressure to come together and form larger blocks. In the US, you have two parties, not because it's mandated by law, but because when you have a first past the post system with individual districts, structural factors sort of push it so that there's incentives for groups from the center left to the far left and the center right to the far right to sort of come together to find some sort of consensus and create a party. The Republicans on the right, the Democrats on the left. But in Israel, every single ideological and religious group has its own party and has an incentive not to go with another party in and create a larger party representing the right generally or the left generally, because they can get in on their own. And this means you have lots of small parties. The government has to include them, and they get a lot of leverage over legislation. You'll have a small group that would have almost no political power in the US. It'd be a fringe, either on the left or on the right. But in Israel, they could call the shots because they're the kingmakers. They have the 2 or 3, seats that are necessary for a majority, for a coalition, or to pass legislation. Now, the issue is the government is then formed from the groups that make up the coalition. So the prime minister is the head of the largest party generally to win seats in the Knesset, and he forms a cabinet from the leaders of the other parties. He's handing out cabinet posts as party favors, which is why we've seen this ballooning of cabinet sizes in recent years. Everyone always says we're going to cut down on bloat, but the governments keep getting bigger. You have the minister for made-up portfolio A and a minister for made-up portfolio B, and the only thing they have in common is each one gets a driver and a staff and a budget, but they don't actually do anything. So there's no real separation between the two. The cabinet is made up of Knesset members. The Rosh HaMemshala, the prime minister, is a Chaver Knesset, is a Knesset member, an MK. And while there is something called the Norwegian law, which allows an MK who becomes a minister to resign his seat in the Knesset and for another member of his list to be bumped up into the Knesset, generally speaking, there's really no differentiation between the actual government and the Knesset. If the Knesset, if the coalition fails, the prime minister's out of a job. It's not like, he's elected independently. Israel flirted with directly electing prime ministers a while back. It didn't take. And so we're sort of stuck with a system that has inbuilt fragmentation. I'm not going to say which system is necessarily better or worse. I think both the United States and Israel have suffered from, a lot of political issues in recent years. But I'm going to say that the U.S. seems a lot more stable in terms of how long its governments last, which means to say they're elected for a period of time and they stay in there for a period of time. You don't have, governments collapsing and multiple elections happening all the time. So this is something that really makes, as well, the issue of the judicial overhaul very serious, because you don't have 3 branches of government. You have 2, essentially. Technically, you have 3, but functionally, you have 2. So the judiciary is the second and the only other branch of government. So if that loses its power, essentially the executive and the legislature, which are one, have unchecked power to do whatever they want.
I have a question from Stephen Mollis, our
Yes.
residents. Sam, do you feel that the American Jewish community has lost all influence with Israeli politicians to make a difference in this internal political debate?
I don't know. I'm going to be very honest. I don't know. I think that the issue really comes down to how much this government cares, one, about the diaspora, and two, how much it cares about the type of funding and political support it gets from Jews abroad. Now, we've seen the World Zionist organizations recently pass a number of resolutions critical of the government. Jewish organizations across the spectrum have been critical of the government. The government really hasn't cared. That being said, you have to remember that a very close confidant of Netanyahu, Ron Dermer, publicly came out a few years ago and said, we should stop focusing on, gaining the support of the American Jewish community. Let's focus on the evangelicals. I think to a certain degree, this is a government that doesn't care as much about the diaspora. One thing we've seen with Netanyahu over the years is his willingness to place the interests of Jewish communities, especially in Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe, well below the interests, short-term interests of Israel on different issues, and his willingness to sort of throw local communities there under the bus. For instance, with what we saw with the recent flap over the diaspora minister coming out publicly to defend people engaging in conspiracy theories about George Soros, saying it's not anti-Semitic. That's reminiscent of what happened a number of years back when the local Jewish community in Hungary was protesting against their government for engaging in a very high-profile anti-Soros campaign, which they felt was, something that could endanger the local community. And the Netanyahu government at the time basically said, "Nah, we're with Viktor Orban on this." You've seen this in terms of Israel's relations with Poland. They'll fight, and then Netanyahu will sign some sort of agreement that will be so egregious that at one point he signed an agreement with the Poles that Yad Vashem basically called Holocaust distortion. So I don't think he's that concerned whether or not American Jewry can have an impact. I still think it can. I just don't know to what degree. It's one of those things, I think, that whatever side you're on politically, if you care about Israel and you live in the diaspora, I think it's something that's your right and your obligation to say something. But how much of an impact? I think this will be decided in the end by local political factors rather than world Jewry.
After Asaf Zamir resigned, the former consul of Israel in New York, he had a conversation with some local rabbis, and he said, Israel is not concerned about what you and your congregations think, but Israel is concerned about what your government thinks. So if you want to impact Israel, start advocating and lobbying with your own government. Do you agree?
I won't. As a journalist, I can't say what people should do. If they should lobby Israel or lobby the American government or what side they should take. That's beyond my remit. Do I think that he's right in terms of his analysis? Yeah, I think so. Whether or not you should, I can't say. Whether or not that's what would be more effective, I think that's correct. Look, Israel is very dependent on the U.S., and the U.S. has a lot of power to influence the goings on in Jerusalem. Whether that'll be enough or not, time will tell.
Marty, please.
I think you're still on mute.
Thank you. Oh, well, let me. I'm on mute or no?
No.
Good.
We hear you now.
Fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
What are your thoughts about major organizations and what their input is, like UJA, JNF, and APAC, how they play any kind of parts? I know what they say they all do, but what is it from an Israeli point of view?
I don't think most Israelis really think about them, to be honest. I think all these organizations do, have important roles in the United States. I think they do a lot for Israel, but in terms of the domestic political, dialogue in Israel, the Israeli politicians meet with these groups. So, but if you read the Hebrew media, you don't see a lot about the diaspora unless there's like a big anti-Semitic incident. You really don't get coverage. I remember, my first major beat at a large paper was covering the diaspora for the Jerusalem Post, and obviously that's an English language paper. And I remember speaking to my counterpart at the time at Makor Rishon, which is a Hebrew paper at the time, and he was telling me that even though that's his beat, he had to struggle to get his articles into the paper because Israelis just don't care. So if you look at, Israeli media in English, Times of Israel, Haaretz English, Arutz Sheva, whatever, there's going to be a lot of diaspora stuff. But if you look at the Hebrew versions of these publications, there's sort of this feeling like, well, what do we care? It's not relevant for us. So as much as it sort of hurts, I think to the average Israeli, they don't think about diaspora Jewry all that much, except when it's something anti-Semitic, which confirms their sort of worldview of, we're in Israel and we're the proud Jews, and if you live in, in the diaspora, you're a weak Jew who's going to get attacked. I think the only news that really breaks through on the Hebrew side is, something that confirms those biases. Unfortunately. I wish I had something a little more positive to say on that score.
I thought that APAC has a lot of input in political aspects. That's where I was coming from.
I think they're important. I think they're certainly important, especially for Israeli, for Israeli leaders to interface with American politicians. But I don't think their input on the domestic political debate here, or really on the political calculus here, is all that large.
I understand that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sam, it is really beautiful to see this mobilization from the civil society in Israel. Do you see an opportunity out there coming from this crisis?
I think that what this has done is two things. One, I think it's created an awareness that we need a constitution, though I don't think that's in the offing. But two, it's also really sort of deepened political divides in a really serious way. So I'm not sure what kind of opportunity is really going to come out of this. I think what could happen, and I'm not going to make a prediction, but I'm going to sort of say this is a possibility. I'm going to present a possibility that if Netanyahu fails and if his government fails and we go to new elections, this could be the final straw for his opponents in Likud to finally depose him. This is a prediction that's been made many times before. I could be just as wrong as everyone else who said this, but I think that's a possibility. It's, I think we're sort of stuck right now, and nobody really knows what's going to sort of kick us out of this, rut into something new. But something's going to have to change, because I don't think things can go on like this indefinitely. One thing I would say, and this is something that I think is something very positive about the political crisis that, I don't think gets discussed enough, is that for, 2,000 years, when issues relating to the, to the well-being of the Jewish community in the diaspora were always decided by, outsiders, by majorities in whatever country we were living in. And the fact that we're having these arguments now is sort of a sign that we've reached the point where we're able to control our own destiny, where we're able to have those big arguments over what our state should look like and how it should function. And it's sort of saying, I sort of look at it as these arguments are horrific, but it's also, our chance. It shows that we're having a chance to decide our own destiny. Yeah, these are big problems, but there are problems, and that's something nice. That's something, that we have to remind ourselves of, because it's not always very obvious, and obviously things are very difficult. But when you sort of take a step back and go, we have these really bad problems, but there are problems, and our problems would be a lot worse if we didn't have this set of problems. We're sort of in the best situation we've been between, even with rising anti-Semitism in the US, American Jews have it better than they've ever had it, than Jews have had it before in history in the diaspora. Jews in Israel, for the first time we have a state. I think despite everything, we sort of have it better than we've ever had it before in a way.
They are horrific, but they are ours, right?
Exactly.
Does someone have any additional question to Sam? So Keith, if you want to.
All right, Sam, very interesting talk. I appreciate you spending the time with us, especially given the late hour in Israel. It's now after 4 o'clock, let alone 3 o'clock when you started. And I think we ought to give you a chance to get some sleep and get back to your family before the rest of them wake up. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
A pleasure.
And let me thank Beverly and Sisterhood for co-sponsoring as well.
Thank you very much for having me.